our webinar friends in now, and we are live on Facebook. Welcome everyone to Kitchen Conversations. I'm April Berg, and welcome to my kitchen. I am really excited today to have with me Senator Joe Nguyen, and he is well, he's amazing first off. And so I've asked the senator here to join me today in my kitchen to talk about a really important kitchen table issue, tax reform. And before we start, I got to tell you a little bit about Senator Joe. He was elected in 2018. He's gone through 2 sessions. He is the first Vietnamese senator that we have had in our great state. And he's got 3 young kiddos. So he's super invested in the future of our state and the future of our state's economy. He also has a tech background. So I like to tell folks that because I think a lot of you listening, both on Facebook and in our webinar, have a tech background, understand technology and the importance of it in our economy. So Senator, welcome to my kitchen and welcome to Kitchen Conversations.
Thank you for having me. I'm so appreciative to be on, and I'm so excited to see all that you're doing up there in the 44th as well. So thank you.
Absolutely. And just, I love the fact that, you know, when we get to Olympia and we're serving folks, we're serving everybody in this great state. So having these conversations across districts is really, really important because we're not going to be siloed off, right? We're going to be all there together tackling these really, really big issues.
Yeah.
So, you know, taxes have been in the news lately. That's one of the reasons why I asked you to come on the show. And they've been in the news for a variety of reasons. And one of them is that, you know, there's a gap, right? There's this gap between who pays and how much people pay.
Yeah.
And that gap was really illustrated at the federal level, right? In a national debate about taxes, because we have, you know, a very supposedly wealthy person who's really not paying his fair share of taxes in the White House. So people started talking, you know, how could that be? How is this possible? So in Washington, do we have a scenario like that where somebody super wealthy, and a super wealthy individual could be not paying the same amount of taxes as folks like you and me and the folks at home?
Well, that's one thing we first put out is that oftentimes the ability to pay that little in taxes sometimes is fraudulent and oftentimes is actually legal. So part of the thing that we have to fix systemically broken systems. There should be no system that allows for people who supposedly are billionaires to pay so much less than working class families. That's what's fundamentally wrong, I think, with our system. If you look at the numbers of millionaires in Congress, obviously there's a disproportionate amount of those in Congress versus the rest of the population. So one of the things that I'll often say when we talk about just policy in general is that we need representation. So when you've had historically a Congress or legislators who are a certain class and they benefit from that, it's not a shock to me to see that their tax preferences benefit them and then hurt everybody else. So when we see somebody like the person that currently occupies the White House paying less in taxes than teachers, than nurses, than students, we realize that we're actually the one paying their bill. So when we talk about taxes, we need to talk about the fact that it needs to be equitable. Working class families are already paying too much. Working class families in Washington specifically, are paying too much. We know that our state has a very regressive tax structure. So in my mind, in order to make it more equitable, you have to have progressive forms to ensure that we're not just burdening families with additional property taxes or additional sales taxes. We're doing it in a way that allows for the folks who, look, if you're a multi-billionaire, congratulations, you're the wealthiest person to ever exist in the history of humanity. You can pay the same either, right? And if you're a working family kind of struggling to get by, we should make it easier for you to stabilize and live. So that's kind of been the core of the conversation that we've had about progressive taxation in Washington state, because we don't want to burden working class families.
Absolutely. So just to your point, we have folks like that in our state. I mean, so do we have billionaires? Do we have folks that represent kind of that inequality? So we do. And I guess, can you talk to me a little bit about that? Because it feels like you and me and probably what, 99% of the folks listening are not in that billionaire class, but we do have them here.
Well, like 99.999% of the people. I mean, unless there's billionaires watching the show, welcome. But no, I don't think that they're probably going to be the ones that are interested as much. So for instance, let's take a look. right? There is one person in Washington State, that since the pandemic started has made over $80 billion just
Wait, did
since
you say made? They made money?
made, not worth, made,
Made.
in addition to what they already have. They've made
Wow.
$80 billion, right? And
Wow.
if you look at the budget shortfall in Washington State, we're looking at,
Yep.
4 billion over the next 4 years. So this one person has made more in the last few months than our whole budget shortfall would be, over,
Over a
decades
period of
uh,
years. Yeah.
of
Yeah.
years. And like and technically that's fine. That's
Wow.
legal. That's a part of the process. But
Hmm.
that's a
Hmm.
policy decision that we have made as a society that I think is burdening regular individuals here in Washington
Yeah.
State, and certainly needs to be fixed.
Absolutely. And I feel like we just came off of these austerity measures, right? So I remember 2008, and to
Yeah.
be frank, 2008, I felt like we had barely caught our breath from 2000. It just seemed like recession after recession, and working class families being hit with one thing after another. So 2008, we've got austerity measures because of recession, and now we're back in recession mode. And I know you've come out strongly saying, look, we can't go back into this austerity mindset for a variety of reasons. So, in this upcoming legislative term, right, where do we start? What are some other options?
Yeah, well, we know it doesn't work because we've done it twice in 2001 and 2008. And
Yep.
like, no
Yep.
fault to the folks who were in charge then. I'm not trying to place blame per se, but we are able to learn from
Hmm.
our past. And if you look
Absolutely.
fundamentally, I mean, like we can go into the economic theory of Keynesian and monetary theories and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Fundamentally, our economy is based on consumers, right? So like
Yes.
if trickle down actually worked, if
Yes.
people believe that trickle down actually works, we should be doing
Hmm.
fine right now because the wealthiest individuals
Hmm.
and the wealthiest corporations are making
Yeah.
tons of money. Yet we're seeing a collapse of our economy. And also thinking the
Absolutely.
mindset a little bit in Washington State, the legislature, technically, yeah, we're in charge of the budget, but really we should be
Hmm.
overseeing the entire economy. The entire economy is more than just the budget we have in Washington State. So what that means to me is look at our state budget right now.
Hmm.
85% of our budget is constrained, whether it's
Yeah.
constitutionally constrained or you get matches for like Medicaid, which you would not want to take
Yep.
away, especially right now.
Absolutely.
Only the things that we could potentially cut is only about 15%. And you're looking at
Hmm.
like higher education, affordable housing,
Hmm.
issues around
Hmm.
homelessness, social
Yeah.
services,
Hmm.
childcare, long-term care.
Yeah.
So all the things that we know people
That
desperately
we
need
need.
right now, those are what
Yeah.
would potentially be on the chopping block. And we cannot make that
Hmm.
happen because if we're able to keep people safe and stable, we can recover a
Yeah.
lot faster than if we have to say, for instance,
Hmm.
take them out of homelessness, which is actually what we've been
Hmm.
seeing for the past decade. In my mind, there's
Hmm.
a direct correlation between the fact that we took austerity measures a couple of decades ago and the rampant
Yep.
increase in unaffordability, which leads to homelessness. And as we mentioned
Yeah.
before, Washington State is one of the wealthiest states in the wealthiest nation in the entire
Hmm.
world. We have multiple folks here
Hmm.
who, to give you context, we have multiple people in Washington State who are wealthy enough to buy every single piece of property in Seattle, buy every single piece of property, and still would be billionaires after the fact, right? So it's less
Wow.
about the idea of scarcity and resources so much as how do we ensure that we as a society are taking care of one another to make sure that we
Hmm.
all get a chance to grow in this economic climate and not just the folks who get tax breaks when the rest of us, basically anybody making under $1 million a year, have to foot the rest of the
Yeah.
bill.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that with the different economic theories that I think have been floated, and they're floated very, theoretically. I guess is a good term for it, right? So the Keynesian model, and that 15-hour work week that I think we're all waiting for. And I think when I look at some of those models, especially trickle down, it seems like our sales tax system is really based on that, right? So,
Yeah.
this really regressive model, and so as we look at having conversations about sales tax and about regressive models, we have a sales tax system where the poorest people are really spending more of their income in
Yeah.
taxes than our most wealthy. And now that we're in a pandemic, those transactions are dropping. And so what do we do, right? Like, so we've
Yeah.
for me, it's, to your point, consumer confidence, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, because it's a system that we're kind of going to have to deal with and battle with. And how do we move forward from it?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it is going to be an interplay between the federal government and the states. The federal government can
Hmm.
print dollars, the state cannot. And we saw
Yeah.
today the current administration has basically instructed his
Yes.
staff to start talking about stimulus for working families, basically across the United States.
Yeah.
That's incredibly dangerous. But
Yes.
one of the things that we'll say, for instance, is that if you make, say, for instance, $20,000 a year, you pay probably about
Hmm.
17% of your income in taxes. If you make
Yep.
over $500,000 a year, it's more along the lines of about 2%. And it's largely because our tax structure is disproportionately weighted to harm lower income
Yeah.
folks because they don't have the same access to exemptions. And honestly,
Hmm.
CPAs and lawyers that can help them avoid some of those implications as well. And we also don't
Hmm.
have, say, for instance, capital gains, which
Yeah.
for people who don't know, when you have stocks and bonds and you sell them, the difference is called
Hmm.
capital gains. We don't have that, nor do we have obviously an income tax in Washington State.
Hmm.
But I
Hmm.
will make a note. I was studying our tax policy, just kind of the history of it. It's largely because of what we have as a uniformity clause in Washington State. So most
Hmm.
states, or a lot of states, have what's called a uniformity clause. If you look at the history of the uniformity clause, it was actually created
Hmm.
back in the 1800s because I'll just put it out
Interesting.
there. Folks
Yeah.
who were slave owners did not want to pay additional taxes on those that they have enslaved. So they created what's called the
Hmm.
Uniformity Clause. And this Uniformity Clause, what wealthy landowners noticed was that this would also benefit them. So by 1860, 20 of the 23
Oh,
states
interesting.
in the Union had what's called a
Hmm.
Uniformity Clause, and it was candidly based on racist foundations. And we've adopted that in
Wow.
Washington State during our Constitution. So that's why we have it. And it's kind of that plus a couple of other things that has made our tax policy the way it is. So for
Hmm.
me, I kind of got in trouble this past week for saying this, but for me, if we want to talk about being anti-racist and being equitable and just, we have to look at the core of how our state was founded, and that's one of the reasons why we have an inequitable tax policy. So I wasn't really shocked when I found that.
Interesting. So, okay, you just took us to school. so,
Yeah,
so,
no,
so these
I
Joe, I mean, no, I mean that. So that, I mean, for me, the intersection, right, of race and finance and the race and tax policy, I think couldn't be more clear. So when we look at that uniformity clause, that really is, again, if it's foundational, that means we're still resting upon it. And so that's one of the things I think as legislators, that would be something that we would look at and see how that's being implemented. But talking about capital gains, and I
yeah,
think for me, when I talk with my citizens, my voters, and they say, look, we don't want taxes, April. We can't afford it. We're literally, I talk with them virtually, I talk with them on the phone. They cannot afford new taxes.
yeah,
And
and they're
I
right. They
try to
can't.
tell, and they cannot. And I try and say, I am not going to raise your taxes. I say it every which way I possibly can.
Yeah.
And I also try to explain to them things like capital gains and the loopholes. So I guess, could you just give my audience and myself just that primer on capital gains and how
Yeah.
it would differ from the federal capital gains that we talk about? Because folks don't want their farming equipment tax. They don't want
Yeah.
their primary residence tax if it's sold. What's the differences and what does that mean in our state?
Well, yeah, at a high level, right? So folks who are generally wealthier have access to stocks and bonds or sell
Yep.
businesses. So they make their income not necessarily like at a job like me and you would.
Hmm.
They don't have like
Yep.
an hourly rate or a salary. They buy and sell things. And the gains on what they sell is what's capital gains. And with
Hmm.
capital gains in the federal level, at least, you pay a much lower rate
Yeah.
on your own salary. So people who aren't wealthy enough to buy stocks and bonds in large volumes,
Hmm.
you're paying,
Yep.
federal income tax, which is pretty high. Capital
Yep.
gains, it's 15%, so it's at the federal level. Some states have
Wow.
their own. In addition to that,
Hmm.
Washington State has zero. So if you look at all this wealth in our state, if you look at this
Hmm.
growth in our economy, the reason why
Hmm.
we're having such tremendous growth in our economy, yet we still have all these systemic issues, is because the growth is not necessarily being reinvested back in the communities that need it the most. It's being hoarded
Yes.
kind of by people who are benefiting from an unfair system. So
Yep.
wealthy people, because they have access to financial instruments that most people don't have access to, when
Hmm.
they make money, they
Hmm.
pay like half of what you and I would if you were just working a
Wow.
regular salary. And the reason why it's a
Wow.
loophole and the reason why it's a little bit different is that oftentimes, when you work, you do your taxes every single year.
Mm-hmm.
You're only
Mm-hmm.
liable for a capital gains when you sell it. So it's much more
Yeah.
a sales tax than it is, say, for instance, your salary. Although,
Mm-hmm.
like we had talked about before with the uniformity clause, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of my jam, so I love talking about this stuff.
No, I'm loving the uniformity clause. I've
Yeah,
got it
so
written down in circles.
yeah, so like in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, mind you, there was a ruling about your income in terms of what you make at your job as it relates
Yeah.
to
Mm-hmm.
the uniformity clause as it relates to property. So there's nothing in our Constitution that says it's unconstitutional to have progressive taxation on income per se. It was a court ruling in the 1930s, mind you, in the Great Depression. The Uniformity Clause
Mm-hmm.
was supposed to just be on your property, on your house, on stuff like that.
Got it.
But that was
Mm-hmm.
kind of extended. So, in Washington State, we've kind of, and what's funny is that back then they actually tried to overturn it, and then it was overturned again.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah, so like we've been fighting this battle since basically the
Yeah.
1930s. And kind of what's come about that is our really regressive tax structure. And one of the things,
Mm-hmm.
this is a bit more wonky, but like we have B&O in Washington State.
Yep.
B&O, I actually hate. I think B&O is one of the worst tax policies that we can do because you're
I
basically
agree.
picking winners and losers, and regardless
Yep.
if that person is profitable, they're liable
Yep.
for
Yep.
taxes I don't think they should be liable for.
Yeah. And the net effect is different on every business, right? So the
Oh
net
yeah,
effect, like
it's
what you're
different.
netting out, it's very inequitable in the way
It
it hits
doesn't make any
businesses.
sense. And it was
Yeah.
supposed to be temporary. So when it was first implemented back in the 1930s, again around the Great Depression, it was
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be temporary and then go away, but we haven't been able to fix it. So in my
Mm-hmm.
mind, given all that context, I think one of the more equitable ways of doing it is a thoughtful revenue option like capital gains, where only the extreme wealthy would potentially be liable for it. The folks who uh,
Mm-hmm.
are, doing fine during this pandemic, who are uh, less than the rest of us are. And you're
Mm-hmm.
right. I think you had mentioned that it's a little bit different than what may happen at the federal level. So obviously
Yeah.
there's a federal level, but in Washington State, the proposals that I've seen would exempt your primary residence, right? So like your house would not be
Mm-hmm.
included in that. Retirement
Yep.
accounts would be exempt. Depending on
Yep.
how big your business is that would
Mm-hmm.
potentially be exempt as
Be
well. So we're
exempt.
talking
Yep.
very uber, like not just wealthy enough to have
Yeah.
some stocks and bonds. We're talking
But
like
at the
you're
very
selling
tippy top.
hundreds of thousands, like unless you're selling hundreds
Yeah.
of thousands of dollars of stocks in a year, you're,
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
first off, congratulations, because you're super rich.
I
Like,
was gonna say, and a lot of folks who are in that category are they are in favor of some type of
yeah,
taxation at that level. It's interesting because they want the quality of life, right, that we have here in our state. They want the good
exactly.
schools, they want the clean air, and all the things that come along with funding a state properly.
Yeah,
And because of our limits on revenue sources, they
yeah,
understand that they're not paying their fair share. It's interesting though, because when you talk with folks at different levels, it's really hard for me to get through and say, this is not a tax that's going to be on our working families. It's not a tax that's going to be on our small businesses or farms or like a kiddo's 529 account, right? I've got 6 kids. And so that would be, when I
yeah,
started
big bucks.
hearing about capital gains, I was like, hey, wait a minute, what about my
Yeah,
529?
no,
And
it
so
makes sense.
um, and those are good questions, right? I mean, we really want to make sure that that the investment tools that we use as citizens, as middle class citizens, and community members, that those aren't going to be unduly taxed. And I'm glad you kind of brought in B&O because I know a lot of our small business owners watching. That's something that really does burden them as well. And so, but you were talking about the uniformity clause and how that relates to the foundational, just that foundational inequity, right? Let's just call it inequity at our state's level. So, can we talk a little bit more about how progressive tax reform and social justice are intersecting? Are there other ways that you're seeing the two intersect at this moment in time?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, they could go a lot. I mean, if you look at the
Yeah,
way our zoning laws were done, obviously
yeah,
redlining,
yeah.
even in Seattle, if you look at the
Hmm.
way banking laws have been created in the past, even
Absolutely.
say, for instance, farmers who are not necessarily white being able to access loans to kind of get through the season
Hmm.
as well. I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
if you start peeling back the layers a little bit, it's pretty rotten to the core in terms of how unjust our whole policy around revenue has been, and really has been, to disproportionately impact lower income folks and also communities of
Mhm.
color, especially Black people. So in my mind, like I see this fight, and you probably see me getting a little
Mhm.
bit passionate, and I say things very publicly, very passionately, but it's because I do think this is the root cause of a lot of the problems that we're facing right now: economic justice, access to
Yeah,
opportunities. I truly believe that talent is universal, but opportunity
absolutely.
is not. And
Yeah.
I think that because of these systemic things that people pretend like that they don't exist anymore, that's what makes it difficult for our communities to be successful. It's not because we don't work hard. That is the biggest
Mhm.
myth ever. If you think your
Yeah.
salary and your work are intertwined, at the back of
Mhm.
any construction site or any restaurant or any mom
Absolutely.
and pop shop that's open 24 hours, I guarantee you there's like an immigrant or
Yeah.
a person of color in the right. And I just
Yeah,
want to be able to reward
absolutely.
that work and make sure that they have the same shot at success as anybody should.
Mhm.
And that's kind of why it's so focused on the
Absolutely.
progressive side of the revenue.
Yeah.
I think without that, we can't afford the programs that we need as well.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think for me, in running and hoping to get there to be that, to be a decision maker and a policy maker, I talk a lot about the economic growth that we need to have to get our economy back on track. And everything you just named is a part of economic growth. And honestly, it's going to grow the economy for everyone. As
Yeah.
we talk about diversity, as we talk about equity, it's an all-in strategy. As our economy grows, it's gonna lift all boats. And so I'm really passionate about not only seeing inequities kind of go away, but go away so that as a society we're better for all of our community members. So but thank you for kind of pointing out that intersection. I'm excited because I'm going to go look at that uniformity clause and see some of the
Oh
history
yeah, there's a
behind
whole
that,
research
because
paper on it. There's a professor at Berkeley
I
that I
I love it.
yeah.
Yeah, because I think for us as policymakers, it's important to understand the history so that we don't repeat it, and so that we can come out better for it, right? So that we can actually make decisions really well informed. So quickly, just kind of this last question that I think is in the back of a lot of folks' minds, and you've been in this space a lot longer than me, so maybe you'll have a better answer. As we talk about this different tax reform and tax policy, and we're talking that it is going to potentially hit a certain sector of people, very minute, right? Very, very small. But will it impact folks wanting to live in our great state, right? And I've heard anecdotally, as I shared, that you do have some billionaires, very vocal ones out there saying, nope, 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 tax me more, that'd be awesome. But have you seen overall, will there be a mass exodus of wealthy people from our state if we do any type of tax reform, especially tax reform around capital gains?
Well, I mean, my first question would be like, where would they go? Right? Like we literally have
Oh, that's a good question.
we have the lowest tax rates for the ultra wealthy, not for regular people. Regular people, they pay about the same as anybody else. But if you're ultra
Hmm.
wealthy, millionaire and above,
Hmm.
there aren't many places you can go. Even if we were to have a, say, for instance, capital gains, at whatever rate we
Yeah.
choose, it's still going to be much lower than what the rest of the country is probably doing. So I just
Hmm.
don't really buy that argument in the sense that, like, first off, if it's purely a math question,
Yeah.
um, I actually don't know where you, maybe Florida, if you
Yeah.
think that quality of life is what you want, but like they really have somewhere where else to go. But I do fundamentally
Hmm.
believe that our great state, the reason why we're so successful is because of the people, the environment, and the
Absolutely.
opportunities that we have
Absolutely.
here. And a lot of
Absolutely.
times, what's funny is my dad happened to be in finance, and I used to work with folks in this kind of demographic. And as we were starting
Hmm.
businesses, it wasn't usually like, oh yeah, what's the tax rate here, so much as what is my opportunity and how can I succeed,
Yeah.
right? Like
Absolutely.
that's one piece of the pie. Um,
Yeah.
Being able to have a thriving business, a quality of life
Hmm.
that is world class,
Absolutely.
a healthy environment that is forward thinking with our environment as well.
Hmm.
I think that's why people want to be here. And there's
Hmm.
other externalities certainly that will cause people to shift, but I mean,
Hmm.
I don't. I mean, like, yeah, whatever
Yeah.
rate that we end up doing is not going to be more than
Than
California
anywhere else
or
in the
any other
country. Yeah.
or any else in the country. Idaho, super conservative state. Their
Hmm.
tax structure is way more progressive than ours.
Oh,
So I don't think.
interesting. Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Texas is more
No,
progressive
and
than
it's
ours.
It's interesting that you say that because I think one of the ways for me that I saw us and how other people viewed us was when Amazon was looking for that second headquarter, and you saw a lot of states and cities and communities try and duplicate what we did here naturally and organically, right? We didn't say, hey, Amazon, start this amazing company here. It just started, right? Because we had the talent, we had the atmosphere, we had the space to say, you can grow an amazing technology forward company
Yeah.
with people who are able to, be here and have what you need, all just right here, all very organic. You had all these other cities trying to just duplicate it, right? Like we promise we'll get better education. We promise
Yeah.
we'll get better on social issues. We'll get better on all this stuff if you just come. And I thought, wow, we did that without even trying. And there's a reason why we have these
Yeah.
amazing technology
There's some
companies
effort.
here.
There's some effort, but you're absolutely right. It wasn't like,
Yeah,
we were very lucky that we had, say, for instance, other Microsoft was here. But I will point out
absolutely.
that when Amazon first started, their tax rates were
Mhm.
3 times higher than they are now. So it's
Oh,
like,
interesting.
yeah. So
Interesting. Okay.
what's fascinating is
Yeah.
that, like, despite
Yeah.
having level of tax rates, they were still able to as a corporation, and not just them, but everybody
Yeah.
else as well. So for me, it's
Absolutely.
you invest in the people. The people
Yeah.
is what makes your company, successful. And you have
Absolutely.
to have some level of buy-in as well.
Absolutely. Well, that's awesome. And just to point out, you said that ultra wealthy point, that was people who are making about $1 million or more per year. Not that you have $1 million in the bank. It's that you're
Yeah, I mean,
actively
like,
earning. And there's a difference there, right? Because a lot of people look at their overall wealth and they say, oh no, I'm a millionaire. And they might truly be, but are you earning, right?
yeah, I mean,
And
it's
there's
pretty
a
high.
difference
Like,
in it's that's
that's
a
a
very
safe,
high
yeah, that's a
threshold.
safe, like, point to call it. But at the end of the
Yeah,
day, I mean,
absolutely.
you're like, it's pretty high.
Yeah,
Like, yeah, I'm
it
putting it
is.
out
It
there,
is
pretty high.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. We just blew right through 30 minutes
That's
of
great.
just, and I could talk about this all day with you. I just love your passion and your knowledge when it comes to taxes and tax reform. And I love that you're just invested in getting us better, right? Making us fair, making us more just for all people in our state. And honestly, it's the economic growth that's going to come from that that's
Mhm.
going to get us through this crisis and any crisis on the horizon.
Wonderful.
So I just thank you for your time. You've really given me a lot to chew on. I always come away from these with a little mantra, and a lot of times it's a little touchy feely. And today it is uniformity clause, and so that is my mantra. I'm going to do some homework on that one. But Senator Joe Nguyen, thank you so much for just being here, talking to our audience, and just doing the work that you do. I'm excited about serving with you in our legislature and getting the work done for all of our families at home listening. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm really
Yeah.
excited that you're running, and I think I can to help you out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone at home. Thank you for joining us on Kitchen Conversations talking about progressive tax reform. Join us next week. We are going to have a fantastic conversation about transportation, which is something that will be driven by how we do our taxes and how we find different revenue sources. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day, Senator Joe, and have a great rest of your day, everyone at home. Take care.